My name is Jen Holmgren. I am a counselor at large in the City of Gloucester, and I am the council liaison for the City of Gloucester Animal Advisory Committee. And I want to welcome all of you here this evening for an incredible lecture by Dr. John Way. We all are very interested in coyote behaviors, and we want to coexist as best we can with these beautiful animals. So I appreciate you all coming and learning more about them. I'm certainly expecting to learn more myself. I want to welcome our Ward 1 Councillor Scott Memhard, who is here. Thank you very much. I want to thank Karen Ristabin and the Rocky Neck Cultural Center for hosting us. We really appreciate you being so flexible as to host us here. Our committee members are all here. Alicia Penzarosa, Jennifer Jackman, Beth Kleinfelter, Jennifer Schmor, Jody Swinson, and Diane Corliss, who is also the City of Gloucester Animal Inspector, are here. And Dr. Jonathan Way, thank you so much for coming. Dr. Way has a BS from UMass Amherst, an MS from UConn, and a doctorate from Boston College related to the study of eastern coyotes and coy wolves. He is the author of 2 books, which are for sale here for $20 a piece. Suburban Howls, an account of his experiences studying eastern coyotes in Massachusetts, and My Yellowstone Experience. John founded and runs his organization, Eastern Coyote and Coy Wolf Research, where he is continuing his goal of long-term ecological and behavioral research on coy wolves. Thank you very much to our supporter, Joan Stone, who was able to help us have John here tonight. Thank you. So Dr. Way will be giving us an inside look at our eastern coyote neighbors by talking to us about them, their ecology and behavior, and sharing amazing photos and video from his research. Thank you. John will be happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. And the Rocky Neck Cultural Center, since they were so generous as to host us, we are asking that if you have any ability to donate money to help them, we appreciate it. And the City of Gloucester Animal Advisory Committee is also raising a little bit of money to help fund future events such as this, if you are so able. So thank you very much, and with that I'll turn it over to Dr. Way. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. This is a very unique basement to be in here with hopefully folks I can see in the back there, unless you're using mirror prisms to kind of get reflected light to see. There's some space behind there too. If we put a mirror up, you might be able to get in. I don't want to sound rude with the please save questions to the end of the talk, but the main reason why I do this isn't because of your interest, but I often answer a lot of the questions that folks in the past have asked me. If you raise your hand and I eventually answer it, of course it takes twice as long to answer that question that I'm already going to talk about. But please, if I don't answer those questions that you have in your mind or you write down, I'll be glad to towards the end of the talk. I have a lot of pictures, I have some videos, so it runs a little over an hour, so it's just smoother for everyone to kind of get a movie-like experience as I go through this, and then at the end we kind of do a Q&A and I'll play some videos in the background. If you're interested, you have to leave early, or you're just interested in my work for whatever reason, easterncoyoteresearch.com is a website that I maintain. I sell the books on there and talk a lot about my research. All the PDFs, publications that I've published in the scientific journals, I think just about all of them are there for free. So it's a resource if you're interested in these animals that you're welcome to use. So this animal, most people here just call them coyotes probably. Not just here in Gloucester, but here in Massachusetts, here in the Northeast. They're also called, more technically, eastern coyotes. Like I mentioned, coyote. Northeastern coyote to get a little more regional specific to here in the Northeast. And also coy wolf. Coy wolf, a term describing their genetic background that I'm going to talk at length about in a few minutes. This animal lives in all of the Northeast. Basically from New Jersey and Pennsylvania up to Maine, New York, and southern Ontario, southern Canada. So of course southern New England here in Massachusetts would be included. It's all the same animal, so if you're talking about an animal in western Massachusetts or where we are right here or down on Cape Cod where I'm from, we're talking about the same animal, the eastern coyote or coy wolf. It's a synonym for the same animal. There's not eastern coyotes and coy wolves here in Massachusetts. It's all the same animal with different names. They're big, but not nearly as big as people think they are. 30 to 45 pounds is kind of the average bigness. Once you get up to 50 pounds, you're talking about an exceptional size eastern coyote. I've handled two 55-pound ones, which really is at their physical limit. Once you get bigger than that, you're really talking about wolves. So that 60 to 70-pound animal your neighbor saw was most likely 40 to 50 pounds because he or she probably wasn't seeing a purebred wolf. Those aren't around here in the Northeast, even up in Maine. And they're larger because of their larger body size, so their tracks are bigger, as you're going to see in just a minute, up to 3.5 inches long from heel pad to claw tip. And they have quite variable color ranges, partly because of natural variation and partly because of their genetic background that, as I mentioned, I'll get into during the talk. The first 10 or 15 minutes, which we're in right now, is just an introduction to the animal. The majority of the talk I'm going to give is more on the research that I've done and the research findings. So this first 10 or 15 minutes is more of an introduction before I get into that research. So here's their range. I just explained it out loud, but a lot of us, including myself, are more picture-oriented. So here's kind of a map of their core range. Of course, we're right about here right now. Their core range overlaps the edge of wolf range up in Canada and western coyote range kind of to the west once you get to Ohio. And then as you get to the mid-Atlantic area, you get this kind of animal that's a mixture of northeastern coyote, or the animal we have here, with western coyote. It has some wolf in it, but not nearly as much wolf as the animals around here. And I mentioned their foot pad size. 3.5 inches is big. I've done some work in Yellowstone. Obviously, that's kind of where my other book on Yellowstone came from. And western coyotes out there are pretty big because up until 1995, roughly 20 years ago, they had 70 years with no competition, no wolves, the western coyotes, and lots of dead elk and lots of dead bison in the national park. So they got about as big as a coyote can get out there because they had lots of food for a long time. And they're still about, as an adult, 2.5-inch long foot tracks as an adult, a western coyote. And that's our pups in July and August, excuse me. July and August, our pups are about that size already. Their feet, at least, they haven't grown into their skeleton. And then as adults, they get much bigger. So when you see a track that size, it's probably not in your tracking guide if you're a tracker for tracking animals, because the eastern coyotes are literally off the charts compared to those descriptions on body sizes. The eastern coyote is obviously successful. That's one reason why we're here today. They're found all over Massachusetts, all over the Northeast. They do feed mainly on small to medium-sized animals, similar to western coyotes. They're very opportunistic. They'll eat apples from apple trees and meat from any source, but their main food supply is certainly mice, voles, rabbits, woodchucks, deer fawns. And as a food source, you could probably patch in a size that's about a deer fawn or woodchuck size, which would be domestic cats. They certainly will eat those if they're available. But they also don't have them as a large part of their diet, meaning that they're not searching for cats at least most of the time. Most of the time they're eating natural food. And of course, where they're available, I'll get into how to avoid that, which is probably pretty obvious for most people. But how to avoid our cats, which I have a cat, I have chickens, and I have a dog, so I don't live in a bubble. These are their main food sources, and there's other things like cats that can kind of supplement them or augment their food source. Larger animals were available. It's interesting because deer in most places want to be controlled, but one of the biggest complaints by segments of the population is that they kill too many deer, even though generally we want to have lower deer numbers throughout the Northeast. So they prey on deer, but deer can be dangerous. Adult deer can kill wolves, like in places like Minnesota, let alone this smaller eastern coyote or coy wolf. So they can prey on deer, certainly deer fawns, but it's debatable how much they prey on them, but they certainly use them as a food source without a doubt. And they live everywhere. This is probably Captain Obvious by now. But 10 or 15 years ago, it might not have been so obvious. They live in wilderness areas in Maine and New Hampshire, to rural places, to urban areas right in and around the city of Boston and other places. But one of the things is they really do prefer edge habitat, because a lot of our suburban areas, whether it's Cape Cod, whether it's in this area, are actually good wildlife habitat. In fact, I can almost guarantee your backyard, if you live kind of in an average suburban backyard, has more rabbits in your backyard or your neighborhood per area than the favorite places that you hike in the woods are. Because rabbits like mowed down areas, they like broken fields, which is your lawns, and they like those pretty bushes that they can hide under or hide in and around. So our suburban areas actually provide good wildlife habitat. Deer, of course, not only are they not hunted in suburban areas for the most part, but they also have lots of food available because all the stuff for them is at deer height as opposed to 30 to 40 foot trees. So prey does very well near people, not because we're feeding the prey, but because we provide favorable habitat. So that's a critical thing for folks to understand, because especially when a predator first shows up in an area, like an eastern coyote 20 or so years ago from around here, they're freaked out, like, why are they here? They shouldn't be living around me. But of course, nobody told the coyote that. They're not really eating our garbage, even though, of course, they'll do that occasionally. They're mainly eating natural foods, augmenting garbage, augmented cats and things like that. But they're mainly getting natural food sources in suburban areas. Out west, you have western coyotes doing the same thing, and you have a lot bigger animal out west that's now becoming pretty common called mountain lions, cougars. They go into people's yards similarly because they have good food sources in many areas out west in people's yards. Neighborhoods is probably a better way to put it, not just yards, but the neighborhood per se, because of the broken mixed habitat that provides good habitat. So of course, this is a perspective that most of us like to see until you have deer like New Jersey and Connecticut that have so many deer that people wish there were less of them. And that's where predators can come into play. But this is probably the slide if you're coming here with a fear for these animals, which is certainly healthy if you have one and you don't know much about them. This is where you kind of put things in perspective. We're just talking for dogs here. The United States, of course, the US is one of over 200 countries that has dogs, because everywhere people are, dogs are. Almost 5 million people are bit by dogs every year. 800,000 need medical attention. And the thing that amazes me most whenever I read these are from the Center for Disease Controls, I didn't just make them up, is not the couple dozen people, and I think last year was actually 34 people were killed by dogs. I just kept this stat there. So about a couple dozen people are killed by dogs every year. But to me, what's more amazing than that, which is pretty sad, of course, is 1,000 people per day go to the emergency room from dog attacks. You know, something that draw blood, require stitches, something like that. So 1,000 people in the US every day go to the emergency room from dog bites. It's a pretty amazing number. About 3 people are bit by coyotes every year in North America. And remember, when we back up to that slide, 3 to 4 people. And there's been 2 fatalities in all of recorded history. And unfortunately, that Nova Scotia attack was on a woman. The other one was on a toddler in California. And that received international coverage in Nova Scotia. And it does seem like 2 or 3 coyotes killed her for some reason. That same year, 2 to 3 people, I think it was 3, died in Central Park from tree limbs falling on them while they were hiking. So it's not to belittle the fact that coyotes have the capability of harming us. Probably not as much as larger predators like mountain lions, but the numbers are decidedly so low that they're really not a statistical chance when you go out in an average area that they're going to harm you. And I just updated this. Massachusetts is up to 9 bites. I had 5 bites until a couple months ago, and I did some research, and it seems like they have verified 9 bites, nothing super serious besides a little bit of broken skin. And half those animals, 4 or 5 of those animals, had rabies. So dog losses exceed and cause a lot of numerical damage, of course, because of our insurance systems. And so this is just video I took, and it shows that these are probably roughly the same size, and it's not great video, it's not great quality, but the animal, the coyote on the left, looks so much bigger than the dog on the right. And I talk mostly about my research, but this is very pertinent information if you're familiar with where I'm from, Cape Cod. Cape Cod has had their first, Massachusetts has had their first coyote killing contest, where some organizers at a gun shop organized a killing contest, and they're doing that legally. And so I always like to back up before I get into my research to explain about these animals, because a lot of people, especially 10, 15 years ago, when they really showed up and people were a little freaked out, were angered that they're fully protected. But I don't think anybody ever told the coyotes that they're fully protected, because from October through March, almost 6 months, you can just buy a general hunting license and kill unlimited numbers of them for any reason. And literally pure hate is justified to do that. I've had my career, I was talking with a couple groups today about that. My career is effectively, all the stuff you're going to learn in the next hour or so has effectively been nullified by the same agency, Mass Wildlife, that allows these hunting contests and some of the techniques I'm going to show you on the next slide in just a moment. They've obstructed my research and made it impossible for me to conduct my research. And I'm going to explain on another slide what that means. What do I do for my research? I'll explain that. But it's important to realize that we have an agency in Massachusetts that allows killing contests, that allows these long seasons. And they make research quite literally almost impossible if they don't want findings to go their particular direction, their way. So these are not fully protected animals for 6 months a year. We're kind of towards the end of that, fortunately, at least from my biased perspective, fortunately, that they're not fully protected as people might think. So what does that mean, a hunting season on them? Well, of course, people are familiar with hunting deer by guns or bows and arrows. With coyotes, you can now use rifles here in Massachusetts. Handguns too, I believe, I was just told, which I didn't realize. You can use hounding, you can use dogs to chase them. In 1996, voters made that illegal for bears and bobcats, but they didn't for fox and coyotes, so Mass Wildlife hasn't changed that. And you can use dogs to chase them in circles. If the dogs don't kill them outright, then you shoot them. You can shoot over bait, which is a very common way to kill them, is to make bait piles, sometimes near your house. If you live 300 feet from another house, you can legally discharge a weapon and shoot them over bait, even at night. You can use predator animal calls to lure them in. And this is solely for recreational purposes. It really doesn't acknowledge anything to do with the science of the importance of predators, the importance of eastern coyotes in an ecosystem. It has everything to do with providing recreational opportunities, essentially to allow people to kill them for fun. We're going to learn in the ecology section of my talk, in my research, why killing a predator like an eastern coyote or other predators doesn't normally work. I'll wait to get to the biology part of that. Other than just that science has overwhelmingly demonstrated the importance of predators in the last 10 to 20 years. Literally hundreds to thousands of publications has shown that. And there's overwhelming evidence here in Massachusetts, even Cape Cod, which is a relatively conservative part of Massachusetts, that people don't support these current hunting laws, things like you see there. Jennifer and I was looking where you were, have published this article once I found out, which basically said a lot of people don't know that these are allowed. And I've known that from the past because I often give these talks with some concerned folks about coyotes in their neighborhood, and then they're actually more infuriated with how coyotes are treated than what has happened to them. That's just been my finding over the last number of years. And that's what our paper does. We analyzed voter preferences, and it was roughly 4-to-1 that people didn't like current laws like allowing baiting, like allowing no bag limits, and other things that are now allowed, including hunting contests, which Mass Wildlife hasn't banned. So just about towards the end here of my introduction to what these animals are, how to coexist with them before we get into the work that I've done. Some of the simple ways, I think we all know this, they're published very appropriately on a lot of town websites, and the animal action committees like here in Gloucester do a great job of trying to be preventative, trying to be proactive. Making loud noises when outside, even toddlers going outside almost always scare wildlife away without even realizing it. Chasing them away might be a little extreme. I heard that some folks around here keep change in a can and make noise kind of like in bear country you do with a bell on your backpack or something. That's a great way to just make animals aware of you. It's probably a small chance that anything is going to happen, but if it makes a person more comfortable, and the other people realize what she's doing, hopefully, or he, then it's a great way to kind of coexist with these animals and still live a normal life. Probably the most important thing in terms of behavior that I'm going to kind of wait to elaborate on during the talk, like I've said a couple times, I'm going to wait to talk about this or that, is leashing dogs. And I'll get into coyote behavior more during the talk than right now. But leashing dogs is probably the most important thing to do. We now know to leave cats inside. Cats are pretty destructive outside in terms of what they can prey on. They can have a bell around their neck. They can be 50% overweight, and they can still catch birds and other animals. They're pretty remarkable predators, but they're also remarkably destructive too. And I do have a cat at home that we desperately try to keep inside as much as we can. Enjoying their presence as an important member of our community, realizing that they're here, realizing that the chance is very slim that they're going to actually confront or hurt us is important to realize when you go outside. And then, of course, the don'ts are pretty obvious too. You're going to learn why not having your neighbors feed these animals is important, because they live in big areas. They don't just live in your backyard. They travel quite a ways. So the three studies that main components that I've been involved in over the last 15 years or so is a wild study, both on Cape Cod and the north side of Boston. I'll show maps of those in a minute. I had a captive coyote study that I don't talk about much here, because most people are here to learn about what are they doing around me, which is probably appropriate. And then the science education component I've done working with high school students. So I've handled many sedated animals, over 50, and then I hand raised a litter. That was a select group, this litter right here of 5, for Zoo New England. And unfortunately, in 2005, a little over 10 years ago, they stopped having me interact with them, even though that was the entire point of my study, was to interact with them. Because we were studying their behavior. We weren't studying them in the wild. It was a specific group of animals. And you're seeing a lot of behavioral components, dominance versus submission right there. And that's why we did that study. I've been trying to do that again. Hopefully on Cape Cod, creating this Coyote Discovery Center that I talk about in my book, and Mass Wildlife has categorically denied me doing that, even though places like King Richard's Fair and Carver are allowed to bring ligers and tigers and stuff every fall for 2 months of the year. So it's very political. They don't want to learn about the animals actually living in their backyard, quite literally backyard, but exotic cats are brought in usually without a problem. So there's a lot of politics around this, but the importance of a captive study is not only the behavior, it's also the education, because obviously if I brought these animals into a classroom, they're a lot less threatening, I should say, than seeing them in the wild, in people's backyards, and you can kind of learn about them in a non-threatening environment. So my ultimate goal is to do this long term. You can imagine, without going too into it, I raised them for 3 years until the zoo said no, and then I, in hindsight, realized why Mass Wildlife agreed with them, because it's a pretty easy thing for them to agree on, not having me interact with these animals. It doesn't show that they're social sentient animals if you don't see pictures of them. But most of my work has been studying them in the wild. I mentioned that website. And just about every finding I talk about in here, and I probably could modify that to every finding I talk about in here, any research finding, any data is published on my website. So it's not just stuff I'm believing in, it's actually stuff that we've published in scientific journals. I'm from the town of Barnstable, right around Hyannis, and that's where the Cape Cod study site's taken place for years. And incidentally, the same town where the coyote hunting contest in Hyannis has originated from. And then the north side of Boston is also where I did work in graduate school. So here's the town of Barnstable. The National Seashore is on the outer Cape. I did it in the more developed part of Cape Cod. Hyannis is a pretty urban area now, a mini city in its own right. And then there's also other villages and another town right around Barnstable. And then I know there's no North Boston, of course, but the north side of Boston was where I did work in graduate school when I was at Boston College, and it's just outside of this area, just south of here, and just north of Boston. So the Revere, Malden, Medford, and a few towns around that area, Saugus, is where we did that work. And the goal of that work, and I mentioned, what has Mass Wildlife done? I'll get to that. Well, this is what they've made hard for me to do. The goal of the research is to capture, put a radio tag, a radio collar if you're studying a different animal, maybe something on its shell if it's a turtle, a radio tag, and then release them. Because when you get that collar on them, it allows you to study their ecology, everything they're doing, their movement and activity patterns, their sociality, are they social animals, home range and territory sizes, den and rendezvous site use. Basically, what are they doing in the wild? But you need a permit to get to capture, radio tag, and release them. And if you don't have that permit, then you can't learn any of this information. So it doesn't take kind of a genius why an agency that is biased to killing these animals wouldn't want research on these animals for the most part. Some of the secondary objectives, which became very important, was to take body measurements, body weight, pictures, of course, but also the blood. And the asterisk for the blood is that's going to be the first major finding, is this DNA research that I was lucky to collaborate with a team from Trent University in Canada on, Ontario. And we found that coy wolf nomenclature from this DNA analysis that I will get to shortly. But it is amazing. These animals are kind of urban phantoms. You hear them, you see them. Some people might see them more. I don't see them quite often, except I don't see them that often, I should say. I don't see them that often unless I'm tracking radio-collared animals. You can see the small collar there that kind of blends right in. But from a utilitarian standpoint, once you get collars on, these are kind of urban animals. You don't see them much. And all of a sudden they become this 24-hour, 7-day-a-week data bank. And these collars on them last about 3.5 years now if you get a new one with a good battery. So they're pretty good technology for a pretty light half-pound collar to last that long. And you can track them and learn about them, assuming that they survive and the collar works, for almost 4 years or so. And you can learn a lot about them, and we're going to go over all that. So the first thing is, what do you mean by capturing them and radio collaring them? Well, obviously this is kind of an oxymoron here, but the animal, the species itself, is highly intelligent. That's why they've done very well and have greatly increased their range in the last 100 years, where most animals have decreased their range due to humans. In box traps we've had to use, because those foothold traps have been illegal since 1996. It's expensive to use these traps. It's relatively hard to get them in because they know they're going inside of an enclosed device. They're cumbersome to transport, 60 to 70 pound traps without any dirt, without any coyote, of course, inside of them. But the public accepts them a lot more because they're kind of have-a-heart type traps. So we've used that. I've used that over the years to capture them. I was told flat out by agencies like Mass Wildlife that you won't catch them in box traps. So I said, well, at least I can get my master's degree in the late 90s, early 2000s, once when I graduated college, of at least documenting if box traps work. And if they didn't work, I could get my master's and then just move on to another animal. If they worked, then I'd actually be able to collect data on those animals by capturing them. So we found wooded areas. Cemeteries are kind of hotspots for wooded areas, especially in urban places like Everett, Revere. That's where you saw that video of one crossing a street by a cemetery, was at the Everett to Malden area. And this is actually the Cape Cod Melody Tent, a pretty developed area of Hyannis, and there's actually a wooded stream right behind it, and we captured an animal there. Once when we find wooded areas that are kind of spread out from each other, so we're not trapping the same coyotes one neighborhood apart, we usually spread them out about 5 kilometers, 3 miles or so. We put out bait, supermarket meat scraps. We get them into those areas, verifying that those 3.5-inch long oval tracks are present. And once I verify that those tracks are there, then we try to condition them to go into the traps. This is the meat here. They have to step on that pan in order for the trap to fire. So this is just conditioning because the animals have to get back there to actually fire this. And you can actually see a green wire that's keeping that door open. It's physically wired open. If you can't, there's a green wire there that physically keeps it open. And then you can actually see the wire there. And then once when we verify that they're going to the back of the trap now, and dogs can take big bones out. We don't quite have bears on Cape Cod yet, and with Mass Wildlife's new regulations, you can now shoot a bear on Cape Cod even though they don't live within 100 miles of Cape Cod. The bait, once they go to the back, then we decide to set the trap. Then I decide to set the trap for capture to try to actually radio collar and eventually study these animals. So of course I'm using supermarket meat scraps, as I just mentioned, and one of the first things that happen is you don't catch a coyote. Lots of other things in the middle of February. Lots of other animals in the middle of February like to eat meat scraps because it's high protein during a low food time of the year. And even uncollared cats often, gulls. And these guys, you can see what happened to this trap pan. These guys, raccoons, of course, can really ruin a trap. Quite literally, they bend the wires. They play dead in the trap. They're real frustrating in a trap because they make it hard to get a coyote in it when they're habituated to it. And we've captured red foxes and a couple of gray foxes, but mostly red foxes in the traps. Red-tailed hawks can really become problematic. I would have never known that they repeatedly go into these traps. I didn't think they were so scavenger-like. They play dead in traps like possums, which makes it fun to get them out. We're letting all these other animals out of the traps, of course, once we capture them because we're focusing on coyotes. Turkey vultures. Fishers, they're in the weasel family. We now know them pretty well. They're thought to be this old-growth forest animal. Now they live in suburbs. They're all over Cape Cod now. In fact, when I started my research, they, as far as we know, weren't on Cape Cod. And most of the captures were in the North Boston area. Mount Hood Golf Course in Melrose, we captured quite a few. And then this one, 10 years ago, was captured on Cape Cod. And we realized that here they are in Cape Cod. And you can really see their weasel-like look. And they're also called bear cats because the weasels are related to both bears and cats. But they're, of course, not a combination. So fisher's actually a pretty bad name because they don't fish in water. They eat squirrels and rabbits. Bearcats is my preferred name, but fishers, bearcats, sorry, are those animals. Crows, one of the smarter animals, we're told. They won't go into any trap, just like coyotes, and we caught over 150 of them. I think they found out that once when they get released that they come back with friends and family. And when you don't have a lot of funding and you have an animal escape, you pray that it was just a raccoon, with air quotes there, that was getting out of there. Because if a coyote did that, it probably is never going to come back. And non-target's a relative term. Non-target's just a term for an animal that's not part of your focus. So if I started research on carnivores and included fishers, foxes, and coyotes, then they would all be target animals. But of course, when you're just studying coyotes, anything else is let go. And it's kind of frustrating to even see a fisher for the third or fourth time in a similar area because you know they're preventing you from catching these guys. But obviously, we've captured these guys. We've captured them with permits in urban areas. But now I've been told Mass Wildlife, one of the problems that they've recently had with my work from 8 years ago was I was trapping in suburban areas, even though my permit was to trap in suburban areas. Farmland areas, you can see she's lactating. She has pups in May. And a lot of the thing you document real quick is how much they do not like to be around people. They're looking the other way. They're playing dead. They're crouched. They're cowering their head away, kind of like a gang walking down an alley. And you don't walk like you're big and bad. You walk kind of like that to not have a presence. They do the same thing. The ears back in submission. By the way, that white face, this is kind of a telltale sign of the difference between an eastern and western coyote. The wolf genes really give them a different look often, like this one, than the western coyotes have. Pup, sometimes 5-month-old adolescent, doesn't really quite know what's going on. You can see its ears, its airplane ears there. But the adults do, and they really do not like being around people that close. They probably think their life is about to end. This is an 11-year-old female that we found out she was 11 by worn down teeth, and then eventually she died and we got her teeth analyzed to be 11 and a half years old when she died. That's pretty old for a wild canid with heartworm and Lyme disease, which most of them have by the time they're adults. But you can see the classic submission traits without me having to go over them all. But to be fair, a few of them, not many, but under 10% of them do show some aggression, and you show up to the trap and they bark and growl at you. They want to get out of there, and it's probably their equivalent to screaming. And it's been rare, but it has happened, and that's probably what most people would visualize. And if you had 100 of these animals and 8 did that, you better believe that that's the animal that would be on the news that night. It wouldn't be the 92 out of 100 that didn't do that and hid in the trap. So that's kind of where our news gets a little biased, as you see animals like that. But she's really wanting to get out of there. The minute she was released with a collar, a couple hours after this process, she ran as fast as she could away. She didn't turn and try to fight me or anything. She just ran out of the trap. Large animals, she was captured near a cemetery, so we just give them little names to track them so we don't have to memorize numbers. This one actually was on the news, Channel 7, about 10 years ago or so, from the Everett Revere area. And it's a lot of effort. We obviously captured some, but it's about 1% to 2% of the time. So if you have a simple number of 4 traps and you have them in the field for 30 days, that's a little over 100 days of traps being in the field when you multiply by 4 by 30 in a month. And you would be lucky in that month to catch 1 or 2 animals, checking them morning and night every day. 1 or 2 coyotes, you'd catch other animals in there. But the way it usually works is you go 2 or 3 months without catching anything or letting lots of raccoons out. And then you have a month where you capture 4 or 5, and that month is like gold for you. But the exhaustion of checking a trap while working a different job for those 2 or 3 months where you catch 1 maybe or none is pretty difficult mentally to deal with, checking them twice a day, usually on your own, having such of a low percent rate. But we've obviously captured many of them. And I've actually captured over 50 individuals, a total of 65 times over the years. The lactating females in May are really cool because you know that when you let her go, she's going to go back to pups, most likely. The breeding males are a little harder to figure out until you study their behavior, because there's really nothing to tell you that they're a breeding male until you see their behavior on others. This animal survived with a broken jaw. I won't go too much into the story, but he was either shot or hit by a car and survived it. This was actually not in Alaska. It was at the Cape Cod Melody Tent, if anybody knows where that is. If you don't, it's just an urbanized area in Hyannis. This was by a cemetery. And of course, I have a different perspective from a lot of people, maybe somebody that lost a pet. But I've had the fortune of seeing lots of these animals up close, and I am amazed by having these animals around, not just these animals, but lots of animals like fishers and other predators, to know that we live in a healthy ecosystem. If we live in an area that can support predators, we live in an area that certainly is healthy enough to support a food chain, and a healthy food chain, not just people, but other animals too. We're obviously seeing sharks return to the water in more numbers than they historically have been. And we now have animals like eastern coyotes, fishers, and other predators that live in our areas, and we know through research that if we live in those areas, we most likely are living in healthier ecosystems. Less poison, for instance, more balance in predator and prey populations usually results from having these animals around. So while I have maybe a little biased perspective of handling all these animals, getting to see them, obviously getting to study them over years, there's definitely scientific evidence to support our claim that having predators around is important. And as we'll learn about, they're actually remarkably easy to live with too, as we're probably figuring out for the most part. There are interactions, but they are pretty easy to live with. The red wolf DNA shows up in a lot of these animals. This was a captive animal that I raised, or in the animals that we box trap, or radio collar. These are all sedated ones that are radio collar. They're basically sleeping for an hour or so before we let them go. This was an animal that lived right in downtown Hyannis, 41.5-pound female that really looked wolf-like. And I would be on kind of parts of Cape Cod that you don't really want to be on at night. There are places like that on the Cape. And she would be crossing those roads, and people would be wondering what the heck I'm doing with an antenna sticking out my car. It was tracking her. And we've captured them in different areas. This one's from Revere, the closest to us here, although this actually is probably just as close, in Everett. So we've captured them in different areas and named them based on capture events, like by where the Cotuit Kettleers baseball team plays in the summer. And the process is to box trap, tranquilize them, take measurements on them, as we've talked about at the beginning, take tissue samples. I'm just about to get to that point of the talk on the genetic results. And then the ultimate goal that I mentioned at the beginning of this section was to radio collar and release them to study their ecology. What are they doing in the wild? And this is going to be the majority of what we talk about in the second half of the talk after I get through some of the genetic research. So the sedation process is very sophisticated. We get a stick, we push them to one side, and we jab them in the butt on the other side. Sometime I'm the veterinary, I act like the veterinary doctor and do the sedation. Other times we have a vet like in the back there doing the sedation, and I'm just trying to mobilize them and focus on this because you want to sedate them, you want to calm them down. Some studies actually have foothold traps. Most of the country allows you to study them, capture them using foothold traps where they grab their paws. And a lot of researchers just tackle them, tape their mouth shut, tape their legs together, get a collar on, do their process real quick, and the benefit to that is they're only handled for 10 or 15 minutes, then they're let go. The problem is, without being sedated, is they're probably almost literally having a heart attack while that's happening. The sedation relaxes them a little bit. They're not really aware what's happening, and we really couldn't do that with them in a box trap anyway because there's no way to do that. So we wouldn't want to. I like to sedate them. And I've really verified that sedation relaxes them so much that they actually seem to forget what happens because we will recapture some of the same animals and just have to let them out with a new collar. Their mate will never go near the trap, but they will go back. So they probably forget what happens. But the main part of the sedation is to just calm them down more than them being easy to work with for us. They're that scared of people. So it's not pleasant to think about an animal in a foothold trap getting tackled, getting its legs taped together and its mouth shut. But they're doing that so they can let it go quicker. And it shows you how relatively docile they are around people. This is at an animal from the Mount Hood at the Saugus Animal Hospital that we worked with and while I was doing that study up in Boston. And one of the most lasting effects we have is certainly putting the collar on them and letting them go, because once the collar's on them, it's most likely not going to come off them for the rest of their life, assuming that they're alive. They stay alive. So we do a pretty simple technique that works well for these animals, a finger width fit, where you can get your finger about an inch or so in between their neck and their collar. Skinnier animals you can put on a little looser. Bigger animals you don't want too tight. You don't want too loose or they'll potentially get too loose as they get skinnier. So finger width fit seems to work pretty well for these animals. And we've had pups that we've captured, pups being an adolescent, 5 months old, that's grown into an adult size collar with foam. Or repeat captures that have had a finger width fit, roughly, my finger's there, and then have been recollared a year or so, maybe 2 years later, with a similar collar with the similar neck circumference size. And it allows them to grow into the collar or to give some space so it's not too tight. And it seemed to work pretty well with these animals over the years. Once they start waking up from the sedation, we bring them back to their traps, take a few pictures that I'll breeze through. As they're waking up from the sedative, they're not nearly awake here. And then we bring them back to their capture location, or in the case of a cemetery, really close so we don't have to walk them through the woods. We just let them go on the road and let them run to the woods. And then once they are let out, you very quickly realize you're almost always seeing them run away and you're getting a good view of their backside. Look up there for the blend in. They really blend into this environment pretty well, like that one once we let them go. And this is that bizarre one you saw the video of just before we started the talk. I won't get into her too much, although she did give birth to normal looking coyotes and travel with normal ones, but she had that bizarre coat pattern. Most of them have this grayish, as you know, coat pattern. And you're getting great views of them running away. But the real work is just to begin, because really you haven't learned anything about their ecology except where you captured them. You haven't learned anything about what they're doing in the wild. But the thing you learn about really quickly is adapting that Russian proverb for coyotes is that they're not only fed by their feet, like the Russian proverb says for wolves, but they're also fed by their adaptability. And that's one reason why they do so well around us. But you might be wondering, what does this mean? So I'll just spend 30 seconds to a minute on radio telemetry. It's pretty simple. When you drive home, although we do have a lot of different digital devices now, but when you drive home, the old school way would have been to turn your radio on to listen to music or news, and you'd be turning to a different frequency when you press button 1, 2, or 3, or whatever button. And that's the same thing with the collar. When you put the collar on the animal, whether it's a coyote, whether it's a turtle, whether it's a bear or moose, each collar has a unique frequency that you know when you buy it. And when you put it on the animal, you better be sure to write that frequency down, or you might not know what it is down the road, and you can tune it into your box, your receiver. And just like your radio, your car, you pick up a signal from the radio station, which is of course a coyote that moves in my case, and you track them and figure out where they go. So each animal has a unique frequency, and that allows you to track them, whatever animal you're studying or reading about. And it's a critical way to learn about them, because even in open landscapes, places like Yellowstone Park, my colleagues that have studied coyotes and wolves out in Yellowstone, they always try to get at least one member of a pack radio collared so you can study the movements of that social group, especially when they're together and that radio collared animal is part of the group. So studying them in the wild, getting the collars on is what you need the permit for, but it's also critical to learn about their ecology. To put it a different way, just about everything you're going to learn about from here to the end of the talk, besides the genetics, involves radio telemetry. And in fact, the genetics is often from the animals that we capture and collar. So we learn about the genetics by capturing them, and then once we let them go, we learn about all their behavior from capturing and putting a collar on them. And I have a video of a capture process, I have a video of a release process, and then I have videos that you were watching that I'm just going to play at the end of the talk, because I know with this crowd there will be enough questions to allow me to show those videos, answer questions at the same time, as opposed to stop right now and show those videos. So I'll show those videos at the end of a capture, real quick, maybe 1 minute, and then release of some of the animals from traps, and then some of the video from the wild if you got here towards the beginning of the talk and missed some of those videos. But the 6 findings, as I mentioned, the first one's about the genetics. And this kind of fascinates people, but at the end of this 10-minute or so segment, it won't teach you much about their ecology, what they're doing in the wild. That will be the last 5 findings, 2 through 6. So I mentioned that these animals are bigger, but they're not as big as people think. But when you look at my size, and you look at these animals, that animal's 45 pounds, somebody from Western United States would be amazed how big that animal is in relation to my size there. They're up to 5 feet 2 or so inches long from nose to tail tip, so they're quite big animals, but they average up to 45 pounds at their largest, and then the exceptional ones are a little bigger. So they're not quite as big as people think, but they're definitely the easiest form, easily the biggest form of coyote. And I've published this data. When you look at their body mass, this is Alaska, that's why it's so far west. When you publish the data on their body size, it's quite clear that from west to east they get much bigger in the northeast, and there's not a big change until you get past Ohio. That would be roughly Ohio on the west to east of the United States. And then when you get into western New York and Pennsylvania, you start getting to what we call the eastern coyote. So that's just the rough geography of that, of the landscape. I mentioned here too, when I go to the next slide, this is 20 kilograms, so 44 pounds. But these are populations, so we're talking about 10 or more individuals of each, and this is for males. We're talking about 10 or more individuals per dot. So I've mentioned that some animals get up to be 55 pounds, but a population of eastern coyotes don't average that large. So we're talking about populations when they average in the 40-pound range. That's pretty big to average that much. And then there's that 40-pound range of a population right there. And when we look at the data, this is just for coyotes from west to east. This is for separating western coyotes to the northeastern coyote or coy wolf to the eastern wolf. You can see quite clearly that the animals here in the northeast are intermediate in body size, bigger than western coyotes, obviously a little smaller than eastern wolves. So numerically, they're a little closer to western coyotes, but statistically, when you look at it from a scientific perspective, they're different. They're different in size statistically from western coyotes and also from the eastern wolf as well. So that's looking at their morphology. They're more massive. Their teeth and jaws are bigger, without a doubt, than the western coyote. Even older ones, you can see this worn down tooth. That's pretty lucky for an animal that age to get to be that age this day and age. And then when you look at their taxonomy, this is kind of one of the easiest and most confusing parts of the slide, of the entire talk, because it's confusing because there's just what the heck am I looking at here? But what you're looking at is lots of hybridization, because the western coyote, the eastern wolf, excuse me, and the eastern coyote all hybridize with each other. They all mate with each other once you get beyond Ohio. So anything from Ohio west, you more or less, there is a little bit of hybridization, but not much. You have more or less a pure western coyote. But when you get to the eastern United States, Massachusetts, different parts of New York, Maine, New Brunswick, you have an animal that has wolf DNA and western coyote DNA, but is grouped differently. The statistical program, which isn't important for our discussion, but the statistical genetic program groups the eastern coyote differently than it does western coyotes and eastern wolves. And for those of you that have ever been to Ontario, Algonquin Provincial Park, this is where those pure, and pure is a relative word, more pure than anywhere else, eastern wolves actually live. Once when you leave Algonquin Park, you immediately start seeing hybridization in the farmlands with coyote-like animals, with the eastern coyote, where you have a more wolf-like eastern coyote or a more coyote-like eastern wolf. So there's obviously not black or white. And the easiest thing here is that the reason why I like the term coy wolf is they clearly have DNA from both coyotes and wolves. The eastern coyote that we call has that DNA. And the easiest thing is that it's really unmistakable that they're hybrids. And I'm going to show you pictures in just a moment to get us to relax a little bit from looking at all these slides. And they're hybrids with not the gray wolf that most people think of when they hear the word wolf. They're hybrids with this eastern or red wolf that I'm going to show you pictures of just in a moment. In fact, we're not quite sure if we ever had the larger gray wolves in the east. All the wildlife agencies acknowledge the extinct animal as a gray wolf, but we think that it actually might have been this eastern wolf, which is very coyote-like to begin with. And even some 1800 pelts that were found in museums tested out to be coyote-like, eastern wolf-like here in the east. Not gray wolf-like, like the bigger wolves found in Yellowstone and up in Canada. Eastern wolves are more closely related to coyotes, not gray wolves. And the hybridization happened about 100 years ago, right in those farmlands area outside of Algonquin Park. And Algonquin Park's not too far from here. You're going to see a map in just a moment. And there's no question, just looking at the DNA of these eastern coyotes, that they have DNA from both western coyotes and eastern wolves, and that some of these eastern genes are specific to just eastern North America. Not too important to focus too much on that down there other than the hybridization part. And there's actually been some interesting DNA that, research I should say, that's been a little bit more recent than just the DNA work, is using Y chromosomes, which is a newer genetic technique. And I'm not an expert on genetics, by the way, so if you ask me a sophisticated genetic question, you probably know the answer better than me. Y chromosomes is the male DNA, I do know that. And they're paternally inherited, and some of the Y chromosome DNA work has actually found not just western coyote and eastern wolf, that is quite obvious just qualitatively looking at these animals, but it's actually shown low levels of dog and gray wolf DNA. And we don't know how dogs got into the coyote gene pool, because in the wild, dogs and wolves don't normally mix too well, because the hybrids, the dog in them don't have the same reproductive cycle as wild coyotes and wild wolves. So in the wild, we have no idea how dog DNA got traced back, but clearly eastern coyotes have some dog DNA, even though the majority of their makeup is western coyote and eastern wolf with those low levels like I just mentioned. And again, if your head's spinning over the last 3 or 4 slides, that bottom bullet point that they're unmistakably hybrids is really the easy point. There's really no arguing that. It's just a question of interpretation of what you're looking at and what you agree with. You don't see this in many of the state wildlife agencies' acknowledgement that the eastern coyotes is a hybrid, but they are. That's really unarguable. And when you take in all of this DNA, the mom side, maternal DNA, the dad side, as I mentioned, the nuclear DNA, and this single nucleic polymorphism DNA, when you look at all the different techniques that are kind of modern, you have an animal that's about 2/3 or a little under coyote, 25 to 30% wolf, with mostly eastern, as I mentioned, and roughly 10% dog. So they're certainly mostly made up of wild canis. And there are some wolf populations that also have dog in their genome. It's believed that the melanistic or black phase of dogs actually, or of wolves, actually originated in dogs. So wolves got that DNA, got that trait from dogs. So the black wolf trait is actually from dogs. So we know that some gray wolf populations have also mated back with dogs. And that's what makes up this animal. But it's much easier to see pictures than it is all those words. So here's Algonquin, here's New York, and of course here's Massachusetts. And that's just roughly why and when they showed up. They just naturally came from this area and colonized northern New England first, where they were called coy dogs quite commonly, and people up there still call them coy dogs, which is an inaccurate term. We know that they're mostly coyote and wolf, with a little bit of dog. And then they showed up in Massachusetts in the 50s to begin with, but in the 70s in some numbers, and then really they got to the eastern Mass area in the 80s and 90s, and of course since then they've saturated just about all landscapes except for eastern Long Island. And I won't get into that other than they have New York City in the way to get there. The colder the winter, the probably better, because they can take ice flows around. And there has been some sightings on eastern Long Island, so somehow they've got there around New York City, but they quite haven't established populations like everywhere else. But besides that, it's about the only place they don't live. And I showed you this at the very beginning, but just showing their range again when you see the colonization of the eastern coyote from the Algonquin area. And this is that map that you saw at the beginning, towards the beginning of the talk. And we do have papers. I'm going to show this for 2 seconds and expect you to memorize all 4 of those. No, they're available for free. I'm just joking. Any of the genetic stuff that I talked about is papers. There's been a little bit of disagreement in interpretations, but those papers describe a little bit of what we just talked about. But probably what you're most interested in, just seeing pictures of these guys, starting with western coyotes that you're probably familiar with, ending with gray wolves, or western wolves, which you might be familiar with. But then you have these hybrid animals in the middle, the eastern coyote, number 2, that obviously lives around here, the Great Lakes wolf in Minnesota, in the Great Lakes area, that are essentially not coyote hybrids, but gray wolf, eastern wolf hybrids. And then the animal that ties this all together is that number 3 that you're going to see, the eastern of the red wolf, that can hybridize with both coyotes and gray wolf. And that they kind of form the bridge to all these hybrids in between, like the eastern coyote or coy wolf and the wolves in the Great Lakes area. So out west, even in Yellowstone, where I said they've fed on elk and bison for years because of the elk and bison population in there that end up dying in the wintertime, they're still not nearly as big as eastern coyotes are, but they're bigger in the Yellowstone area. And then of course you've seen pictures throughout the talk of these animals. There's different ways to scientifically describe them. I think that's probably the best way, Canis latrans times lycaon, to show that they're hybrids between 2 species. But there's also those other species involved too, so it gets confusing. Red wolves are found in the wild in North Carolina, southeastern US. I won't get into them other than there's a lot of politics associated with red wolf management, even though there's less than 100 in the wild now. And you might say, what the heck is the difference between these animals and all the pictures of the eastern coyotes that you've seen throughout the talk here? And there's not a lot. This is a picture from the Roger Williams Zoo that I took. And it's probably a 50 to 55 pound male, so it's bigger, but not significantly bigger. And it has just a little bit of different DNA, more specifically related to wolves found down in the southeast. And then you get to Algonquin, and you have the eastern wolf, which is either the same or a very closely related species as the red wolf. And these are 60 to 65 pound wolves. So once they get bigger than 65 pounds, you probably start having some gray wolf influence just outside of the park. That's why when a neighbor of yours says, I saw a 60 to 80 pound eastern coyote in my backyard, it was huge, it looked like a wolf. I know it wasn't that big because the wolves in Algonquin Park aren't even that big. They're at the lower range of that, but not the upper range. And that's probably New England's original timber wolf, and it would be real interesting if we could ever get old pelts from 200 to 300 years ago to verify if these are the same wolves as Algonquin. But it seems to be this is the New England's original timber wolf, and you can kind of see the eastern coyote-like look in it because that's where they got some of their DNA is from these animals. When you get to the Great Lakes, you move a little west of the eastern U.S., the kind of leaving the eastern U.S., you get animals that are gray in eastern wolf hybrids, and they're bigger than the eastern wolf. They're about 70 to 90 pounds, 70 to 90. And you start seeing that blockier head, that kind of wolf-like look that they have, compared to the eastern wolf and, of course, the different types of coyotes. And that's when you start getting a larger animal, as I mentioned, the lupus and then the lycaon. Lycaon is the eastern wolf again. You get a little bit of hybrids, but they're a bigger animal, 70, 90 pounds. And it's not till you get to the western U.S. or very northern Canada that you get more or less a pure gray wolf. An animal that is just gray wolf is what most of us think of when they hear the word wolf. This was a 115-pound male that traveled the roads in the wintertime. It was easier for him. I got pictures of him. He was wild. And he ended up getting killed by other wolves. He was 115 pounds. He would be the size of a deer if you saw him in the wild. So these are what you think of when you hear the word wolf, the larger gray wolf. But it's debatable, as I mentioned, if we ever had them in the East historically. So we know that these animals are hybrids, but we still haven't gone over what they're doing in the wild, and that's what we're going to talk about now. The first thing that we learned by getting the collars on them and then tracking them in the wild is that they are territorial. They use these large home ranges, the areas that they roam, but they also guard them from others of their kind. So we know that almost every predator has a home range. They roam quite a bit. And we also know that just about every predator has a territory. They actually guard them from others, that they kind of regulate their own numbers. So most of a Canada's home range, whether it's a fox, a western or eastern coyote, or any kind of wolf, is always territorial. And they're large. They're roughly 10 square miles or so. So on Cape Cod, I tracked this animal. I found her about 500 times. This is exit 5, Mid-Cape Highway. It's not a great quality picture, but all those dots is one time when I found her. I didn't see her most of the time. Most of the time she was in the wood and I was just getting her signals over there or over there. But she was mostly in the woods. But occasionally I'd see her. I probably saw her about 10% of the time. And I plotted all of her locations with those dots on the map. And then I plotted her actual location of her kind of Pac-Man shape range. She didn't use that marsh. She didn't swim across the marsh, at least that I documented. And that was about 8 square miles, getting rid of the outliers where she went, but not often. And that was about 8 square miles. This is a 5.5 mile long barrier beach. 5.5 miles from one side to the other. And you could see she used all of that and then some on the other side of that barrier beach. Kind of similar to some ecosystems around here. So if you have this barrier beach that's 2 or 3 miles long, most likely the animals are using all of that and then very regularly going on and off that barrier beach. It's not like there's 8 coyotes on that barrier beach and then 8 more off the island. And I can almost guarantee that because that's been very common throughout the research is to see these type of movements. But when you plot that location, that territory, excuse me, among all the other territories that I've studied over the years, you can see the territories kind of form. One was pretty small compared to the others, but they kind of, with a little bit of overlap, squeeze each other in to these non-overlapping areas. And especially when you do it based on a certain time, you really see this kind of smooth territory where one ends and the other begins. And then actually, after I published this data, I finally caught an animal down here. 2 animals actually. And that fit right in. It's a different map, but you can see that island right there. And you can see these 2 animals, they ended up expanding their range, used about the same area. And all these dots are houses from 1972. I really like that map, but it hasn't been updated, this topographical map. And you can see this one pack has about 1,000 houses in their home range from 40 years ago. There's probably double the number of houses there now. So lots of houses in this one pack. So if you live in this neighborhood, Some people think that they just live in your neighborhood and they go to the water and then they come back to your house. Whereas they're regularly traveling drawbridges to get to this island, which they would take this drawbridge right here. They'd have to take the drawbridge back at night. They would go throughout all these areas. And when they have their pups, they go through all these areas and have to return, like to down here where they had their pups 1 year. And so for one reason or another, and I won't get into the politics because you know it just as well as me, people think we need to control their populations for one reason or another. And I have evidence, and I published this, that when the breeding male of this pack died, their numbers weren't reduced. Because that original territory, 2 years after he died, the solid black polygon there, ended up being subdivided to 2 territories where each pack, roughly north of the Mid-Cape Highway and south with just a little bit of overlap there, each pack had 3 or 4 adults in the wintertime, whereas the original pack had 3 or 4 adults. And so I actually tracked them for 2 years. He was the only collared male here, and he clearly traveled around with 3 other animals to make 4. And I tracked them all the way until he was shot by a hunter on the last day of hunting season about 5-6 years, probably about 10 years ago now actually. And the same thing with her. She traveled around with multiple other animals, and they used the same social group size with a smaller area. And essentially that original territory after he died was double in coyote numbers. So removing him ended up increasing a coyote population, at least temporarily. So with a territorial animal, it's not so quite so simple unless they're causing specific problems, and we won't get into what a problem is or isn't right now. You don't just automatically reduce a territorial animal's population, because usually more just fill in their that area. So you hear howling. It's kind of a rhetorical question. You don't have to raise your hand. What are the functions of howling? I have video of animals howling. I have pictures of them here too. The main reason why you hear howling is to interpack, to communicate amongst packs. And we have good evidence that the longer packs are left alone, the more they stabilize their own numbers, because they use those larger territories. You probably noticed some of those polygons were bigger than others. Almost all of those bigger polygons had older animals in those territories, meaning that a male or a female, the females are pretty territorial too, one of them or both of them, if they both survived, guard an area and they end up claiming those larger areas. They seem to just instinctively want to use large areas, 10 or so square miles. And they howl to communicate. And there's no question that they can recognize each other's howls, and when they're left alone, they probably recognize each other's neighbors and form stable territories. When the opposite happens and there's mass killing going on somehow, some way, or for whatever reason, you have these territories that are never satisfied, so you just have never filled, I should say. And you have these animals that are just constantly moving in, establishing these territories. And so that's sometimes where you have an increase in a population is the territories are vacant from at least older males and females, and younger animals kind of constantly try to colonize those areas to establish a territory. And sometimes they take just part of a territory because others are moving in doing the same thing on the other side. They rally with each other. The captive animals clearly did that with me. They like to howl and rally. It's like a bonding moment. Why do humans sing? When you think about it, it's kind of something odd for us to enjoy to listen to, but we do. But the other main reason besides communicating amongst packs is to also find each other. They have unique howls, lone howls. Lone howls often have to do sometimes with mourning if they're in a, something happens to one of their pack mates, but it's also to find each other. And they can often find each other by howling too. Doesn't seem to have much to do with us. If we stop living in our houses, they'll probably still be howling around our houses. And so this is a perfect example of why I say please wait to ask questions, because almost everyone, when I didn't used to say that, would say, well, how many live in a territory? And that's the next finding there. And I kind of mentioned it out loud, but I wanted to have it as a kind of a bullet point as well, is we have these animals living in the pretty big territories, whether you call them coyotes, eastern coyotes, or coyotes, they're still doing the same thing with that genetic background. And a pack or a family is at least 3 wild dogs, wild canids living together. And it seems very consistent that 3 to 4 adult-sized eastern coyotes or coyotes live together in a given territory. And it seems to be, assuming that they survive, the breeding male and female, essentially the parents, as well as some older offspring, from the previous year or two that stick around to form that pack. So right now we're in, basically, let's just say March 1st. And the pups are born, give or take, April 1st. So the pups right now would be about 11 months old. And so if you have 4 animals travel right through your neighborhood very quickly, you might not notice a difference in size, but most likely you're talking about a male and a female and 2 of their offspring, most likely 11 months old, that are following them, that are kind of being part of that pack. And that's typically what a wolf pack is. Maybe with a few more animals, 3 to 5 might be an average wolf pack, unless you get to a national park like Yellowstone where there's more food. But an average wolf pack isn't quite as big as people think it is. And eastern coyotes are more social, and so are western coyotes, than people think they are. Western coyotes aren't these lone animals. They're only lone animals when there's aerial coyote programs where they're getting killed and poisoned. But where people leave them alone out west, they're pretty social too. So that's a misnomer with coyotes, as western coyotes are even pretty social too. And this is a social cycle of them. With wolves, you might have a couple generation of offspring. With most coyotes, you usually have a single generation of offspring that eventually disperses their second year. But sometimes you see packs of 3, 4, even 5 or 6 eastern coyotes living together. So they're definitely social, and they're more social than people give them credit for. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just talked about it. But you have the parents. The helpers are also called the betas, but the helpers is probably the easiest one. They delay dispersal to be with their family, their parents. And then when April 1st comes, give or take, you have the pups of the year. And if the pups survive their first year, they either stick around with their parents, as I just mentioned, or they leave and go to new areas. That's when they're called transients. They go from point A to point B to disperse and go find new homes. That's assuming they survive. Of course, when they're pups, that's when they often die from cars or any other type of mortality agent. So here's a typical Where's Waldo pack that I'll zoom in. Not a high quality there. But when they travel, you can see them. And then one of the advantages of captivity is you see them just a little closer. We have to actually zoom back. And then their activity. And this finding is remarkable, not because I did it, but because of carnivores in general. Because carnivores, almost any carnivore you could name, and you'll be impressed with some of the ones I name in just a second, are almost always nocturnal when they live near people. Doesn't mean they're never active during the daytime. It just means they're much more active at night, especially when you look at it from a statistical viewpoint. Dawn and dusk, variable. Daytime, not much. One of the reasons why we advocate not feeding animals like coyotes is they're intelligent. And I'm amazed how many people feed them and how many coyotes still come in at night. Meaning that I've tracked collared animals where I know people leave food out unrelated to the research I've done, and these guys still only come in at night, and I'm just amazed that they know there's food there and they wait till night to come in. It's because they're shy around people. But it also doesn't take a stretch to imagine that some animals are going to learn that at 10 o'clock that food's being left out, I'm going to start getting much more active, and that's when problems arise. These animals are around us. They're mostly nocturnal, and if we do things to encourage them, that's when you start seeing changes in behavior. Doesn't happen as much as from a biologist standpoint I'd think they do, but obviously you know some of the circumstances that happen. They hang around people at night, they get aggressive. Hang around people during the day, I meant to say. They get aggressive, and that's often from them changing their behavior. But mountain lions out west show variable activity, almost always active at night around people. Believe it or not, grizzly bears leaving Yellowstone and glacier parks are now going into farmland areas. Farmland areas are kind of the urban areas out west in many places. Of course, they're not urban to you and me. And grizzly bears are almost always active at night. In fact, GPS-collared grizzly bears, the researchers couldn't believe where they showed up at night compared to the daytime. So it's not just eastern coyotes. It's almost every type of predator will be active to avoid people. Mostly. Not very active during the day, especially statistically speaking. But this is a roadkill deer with a pack that obviously was caught on camera there. They're much more active at night. This is a red-looking animal. It's not just the photograph. And then as we get to the second to last finding as we finish up here is, and I've mentioned some of these out loud, I just like to have them as bullet points, and I have video of some of this, is they typically give birth in early April, so that means their mating season's over. It happened mid to late January, maybe early February, and now the females are gestating. They're still allowed to be shot for another couple of weeks. And then in mid-March, at the very earliest, is when they give birth, but typically towards the end of March, early April in this area. Typically it's in the woods. Typically it's to 5 pups, but there's of course variations. 4 to 6 would be about the average. And I won't get into this too much, but there is some part of this cycle where breeding females in April to June will show some daytime activity, more so than others, and that has to do with their pups in a hole during the daytime. The parents and the helpers can, their mate, I should say, and the helpers can kind of guard the area while the females go out looking for food, even just water. Typically that's a hole in the ground. It's about a football-shaped, basketball-sized hole. So not as small as a football, but not that big. They don't want them too big so other animals like people or wolves in other parts of the country can get in. If they want to squeeze right in, that's a typical hole in the ground. And then that would be a pup that comes out of the den. And there's a bigger pup. And of course, I mentioned raising those animals. I didn't spend much time talking about them. I talk about them more in my book. But when I raised the animals, that's when they, excuse me, started to get very active. And when they start getting real active, you get to about June, right around when kids are getting out of school. And when they're about 2.5 months old, they kind of go to part B of the denning cycle, which is abandoning den sites, leaving those den areas and going to what are called rendezvous sites, these above ground meeting places. So if someone saw a den in October, I would say, cool, it probably wasn't a coyote den, or at least not an active den, because they don't use dens in October. They're above ground, sleeping in the woods. The pups in the rainstorms are getting wet by rain, sleeping in thick, brushy areas, maybe briars or something like that. And on Cape Cod, I mentioned that human theme. They do really well in places like cranberry bogs, golf courses, in this area more than where I live, agricultural fields. You have those open landscapes, places to hunt in those open landscapes, especially I didn't mean to say rabbits, rodents. Not that they wouldn't hunt rabbits, of course, but rodents and insects are real big, especially around cranberry bogs, that the pups will be trying to eat and prey on while the parents are coming to and from those areas. But these areas often have thick, brushy areas and water. Think about cranberry bogs. They're open, but there's thick woods around them. Most agricultural fields are like that too. There's woods around the field. And they do very well with that mosaic of different habitat types. Not just open, but not just wooded. There's lots of sightings by the public because the parents come and go from these areas, and they're kind of puppy training centers, with the males spending just as much time there, if not more, than the female coyotes. And this is where dog interactions very often happen, is rendezvous sites are, I have watched western coyotes out in Yellowstone commonly chase wolves from their pups, where wolves often kill them the rest of the year. I've watched them nip grizzly bears in the butt, and they just have to have a numeric advantage. 2 coyotes to 1 wolf, 3 coyotes to 2 wolves, they will chase them, and they'll chase them aggressively. And so it's kind of instinctual that this time of year, when they're unleashed dogs, the coyotes get really aggressive because they want to keep the dogs away from their pups. And there's no question it has to do with their evolution, even though these animals are coyote-wolf hybrids. Their evolution as coyotes with larger predators preying on them and preying on their pups especially. And so most of the year, the coyotes ignore people. This time of year, they sit, they watch, their pups are in the back. I knew she had 6 pups that year. And when unleashed dogs come through that rendezvous area, they get aggressive and they try to keep their pups away. And what's interesting to me is when the dogs are leashed, when people are around, the coyotes usually, not always, behave much differently. But when unleashed dogs come to these areas, they often are hyper aggressive. When they're bold around people in these areas with a leash dog, they often escort the people away, not because of the people, but because of the dog. And when the dog gets to a certain point away, they just turn around. And I've heard that story so many times. A lot of times when you raise your hand in just a moment, I won't be able to guess why your dog played with a coyote or vice versa, or why the coyote played with your dog. But when you have a leashed dog walking away from an area with the coyotes following from a distance and turning around, it's almost always because they're just keeping an eye on the dog to get away from their pups, and then they just kind of escort back to the pups after that. So very frequently, the leashed dog prevents that interaction from happening, even if the coyote appears kind of bold and threatening by standing there and not backing down. And it's often because, of course, you don't see them. If you see them, you would know why. The pups would probably be running in the woods before you saw them, because they saw the dog first. Typical rendezvous site there, you have that contrast of open bog where there's lots of rodents and insects, woods, and of course water in between. This male was nothing special in size. He was just a 35-pound male. He spent lots of time with the pups. I had him collared for a number of years. And I saw him much more with his pups once they got to the rendezvous site stage than his mate. And it was no doubt his mate was just exhausted from nursing the pups for a couple of months before that point of their life cycle. It's kind of a national park-like setting. You could stop your car, pull off to the side of the road, and watch them from a distance. It was pretty cool there to see that up close. And then the last finding, before I finally get to your questions here, is just their movement patterns, their movement and dispersal. They travel quite regularly to access these different territories, the different areas of their territories, I should say. They travel very often 10 to 15 miles a night. They go through altered landscapes very well. These areas, power lines, cranberry bogs, as I've mentioned, dumps, even railroad tracks to get into places like cities like Boston and New York City. These are coyote highways, literally. And even highways are highways because highways are pretty linear for us to drive. So they're very good dispersal corridors. And I've had people theorize that the dispersers will go into the medians to travel in the middle to avoid resident packs and just travel down them. I don't have any information other than I would buy that. It sounds right. Neighborhood roads, especially at night, are good ways for them to travel. And when you have very simple, when you use, I should say, very simple math of 3 to 4 animals in a pack this time of year, 10 to 15 miles a night, that would be about 50 miles per territory per night that each pack is traveling on. That's why it seems like they can literally be everywhere, whereas in reality they live at pretty low densities. Traveling on power lines, across roads, in neighborhoods, they can do quite commonly, quite easily. You saw that video of crossing through holes in the fence, down an open gate to get from one side of a cemetery to another. And even nearby here in Concord, Massachusetts, going under Route 2 by using an underpass. Where you build it, they will come, not just coyotes, but many animals. And this is kind of an extreme movement, but I had a male collared in Hyannis, and it was just by dumb luck that I found him 10 miles off of his parents' territory one day. I also had his dad collared. He was one of those 10-month-old pups when I caught him. Relatively full size, just a couple pounds off of his eventual weight. But one night I said, gosh, he's over there. I only found him because I just had his frequency on when I was driving home from, let's say, right here after I found another animal. And I said, I couldn't find him today. I'll just keep it on while I drive home. And sure enough, as I was driving home, I got his signal. So I said, holy smokes, I better go find him tonight, figure out where he goes. I might never find him again. If he goes that way, he's off my study area going to the Lower Cape. Sure enough, he traveled back to his parents' territory right on power line corridors and went to here, got to the Otis Air Force Base from Hyannis, and then found his dad. And the next day they were all, I saw his uncollared mother at that point too. The 3 of them, it might have been 4, the 3 or 4 of them were together sleeping in the core of their territory where I would have never have known that 25-mile movement, roughly 25 miles if you take the miles of that, including going through 5 of Cape Cod's 12 towns, not the entire town, but touching foot. So they really move, and they have this 2-dimensional, long-distance-like body shape. Even in the snow, when we have snow, they can travel quite a bit. And regularly, this is one of the biggest lakes on Cape Cod, Wequaquet Lake, right by exit 6. And regularly, their movements cross highways, go 10 to 15 miles a night from one side of a territory to another. And they regularly do these type of movements on an average territory size there. So when you see a picture like this, and this was that male that used that cranberry bog that I happened to track one morning when he obviously caught a cat. You wonder whose fault it is when we could have left cats in the first place. It's not from a preaching to the choir viewpoint, but it's really from a biological viewpoint. It's a real easy problem to avoid. And this happened at about 5, 6 in the morning. I could tell he was in that neighborhood for a reason. And then eventually I found out why he was in that neighborhood, because somebody left their cat out all night. They're looking for cats more as a food source, to put that outright. Dogs are more for competition. So dogs are really unfortunate because there's really no winners here. Of course, we and the cat lose in this scenario. He's getting fed, but with a dog, it's more of competition. I haven't heard of many dogs that have ever been eaten. Maybe small dogs that don't look that are the size of cats, but the average dog is usually just a competition type of thing. So obviously, the best way to avoid that is to not have that happen in the first place. But when you see that viewpoint, your perspective can change after learning about what these animals are really doing around us. That's the point of showing that. The part B of the transients, as I finish up in the next minute or two here, is not just the territories that we talked about, but also those youngsters, usually youngsters, sometimes old animals that leave their parents. Once when they leave their parents, they can have these localized movements where this one animal, all those white squiggly lines, really focusing his activities down there in Hyannisport. The white squiggly lines is one animal moving over the period of 2 months through all these different territories, very localized movements, kind of in and out of territories, looking for an available mate, we presume. That was a male that was doing that. Other animals go from point A to point B. We caught an animal in Revere that went through the railroad tracks, under the Zakim Bridge, and eventually went down to the Rhode Island border. She could have come from New Hampshire or Maine. We actually caught her in Revere clearly as she was moving south. So it was kind of a frustrating capture until someone from Dartmouth emailed me that they were seeing a collared coyote regularly 6 months after we lost track of her, 60 miles away. One side of Cape Cod to the other isn't much of a challenge for them. This animal, I had his mother collared for years. She was actually the bottom of that polygon where the pack doubled in number after that male died. She was the bottom one, so she lived there for a number of years, and I caught her son, a couple of her sons. This is one of them. He left for some reason right around now, 11 months old, disappeared. Once he crossed the canal, he probably swam the canal. He could go the bridge too, but he probably swam the water, which most of them probably do. He ended up in Hingham, and it was very similar. Somebody emailed me, I'm seeing a collared coyote on my bird walks. And I said, are you kidding me? I drove up, and 51 miles from where he was born, he established his location in Hingham. Why he did that, we'll never know. We just know that young ones can leave and go multiple hundred miles from where they're born. So 51 or 60 miles isn't anything out of the ordinary. So when you learn about their ecology, you realize there really aren't too many of them. There's not an overpopulation of them. When they show up in an area, they saturate an area very quickly with that territory behavior. And when they saturate their territory, there's really only a certain number of ways they can increase their population, and it's decrease those territory sizes or increase their pack sizes. And that probably only happens at a very marginal level. We don't see animals typically bigger than 4 or 5 or 6 animals in a pack. And then we don't see really tiny territories in most areas because these animals are bigger. They use larger areas. So the overarching conclusion is more education. They're in they're in our neighborhoods. They're in neighborhoods in general to meet their ecological needs, despite unfortunate interactions, whether it's coyotes and dogs, which is obviously unfortunate when people lose dogs, whether it's that tragedy from almost 10 years ago. There's still things that are much more likely to happen to us in our daily life. Unfortunately, our drive home is one of the most dangerous parts of that. But there are other things that happen that are much more common than a coyote attack. So it's not that we shouldn't be cognizant of them, it's just that we should put the risk in perspective is the only reason why I show that.